They were the icons of masculinity, charm, and style, the men who lit up the silver screen and captured the hearts of millions. With sculpted cheekbones, commanding voices, and perfect silhouettes, they appeared flawless. But behind the scenes, beneath the lights and makeup, many of these legends carried a closely guarded secret, one that involved hairpieces, toupees, and a battle against time itself. In this video, we uncover the hidden world of wigs in old Hollywood and reveal which of your favorite stars were never quite as full-haired as they seemed. Stay with us. You're about to see Hollywood as it truly was. Humphrey Bogart, the tough guy with a fragile secret. Humphrey Bogart didn't need muscles to be menacing. He didn't chase charm. It clung to him naturally. With a cigarette perched on his lip and that weary, knowing stare, he became the archetype of the cynical hero. In films like Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon, he wasn't just playing tough, he was tough. Or so it seemed. Behind the trench coats and the cold stares was a man as concerned with image as any matinee idol, and one determined to keep his vulnerability out of the spotlight. Bogart began losing his hair early, and by the time his most iconic roles hit the screen, the transformation was already in full swing. Yet audiences never saw it. On screen, his hairline was always sharp, the silhouette always intact. What they didn't see was the painstaking attention paid to concealing what the camera could not forgive. His toupees were as much a part of his costume as his overcoats and pistols, but unlike the wardrobe, these were never acknowledged. For Bogart, who built a career on authenticity and grit, the irony is striking. The man who defined realness for a generation of moviegoers was also engaged in a carefully controlled illusion. Every frame, every close-up was curated, not just for performance, but for preservation. The preservation of mystique, of power, of masculinity, in its purest cinematic form. No one questioned it. No one dared. Bogart had become bigger than the truth. The hairpiece wasn't a lie, it was armor. And like any great screen legend, he wore it without apology, never letting the mask slip, even as time tried to expose him. Humphrey Bogart stayed untouchable. And that too was by design. John Wayne, the rugged cowboy with a manufactured mane. John Wayne didn't play characters, he embodied ideals. He was America on horseback, a towering symbol of grit, honor, and frontier justice. The walk, the voice, the presence, all unmistakable. He didn't need fancy words or elaborate costumes. A hat, a holster, and a squint were enough. But even as he conquered deserts, plains, and box offices, there was one battle he quietly lost, one the camera never caught. Wayne began losing his hair in his 30s, and by the time he became a box office titan in the 1940s, the damage was done. But you'd never know it. The man who wrestled cattle and outdrew outlaws was doing it all beneath a perfectly sculpted hairpiece. His toupee wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was rugged masculine, tailored to fit the myth. It sat beneath his cowboy hat like it belonged there. And to audiences it did. The hairpiece wasn't just about looks. It was about continuity. In an era where studios owned images like property, Wayne's appearance had to remain frozen in time. A balding cowboy didn't fit the fantasy. So the toupee became part of the uniform, maintained with the same precision as his boots or saddle. But Wayne never acknowledged it. That wasn't his way. The silence was part of the code, a quiet agreement between star and studio, between legend and legacy. The illusion had to hold, because the idea of John Wayne was bigger than any one man. It was a myth that needed to walk tall, ride fast, and never grow old. The hair may not have been his, but the legend was. And he protected both with equal conviction. Clark Gable, the king's crown, was borrowed. There was a time when the name Clark Gable stood as the very definition of manhood. He didn't just star in films, he commanded them. With his gravelly voice, commanding presence, and that sly, crooked smile, he reigned as the undisputed king of Hollywood. Women adored him, men copied him, and studios molded films around him. But behind the carefully crafted image was a detail Gable never wanted the world to see, one that quietly challenged his myth every time he stepped on set. By his mid-30s, Gable's hairline had already begun its slow retreat. What audiences believed to be a full head of perfectly parted hair was more often than not a masterful blend of precision styling and one of Hollywood's most sacred props, the toupee. His hairpieces weren't flamboyant or theatrical, they were made to disappear. Seamlessly. Silently, studio makeup artists worked their quiet magic, crafting illusions not with scripts or spotlights, but with lace fronts, adhesives, and the perfect blend of grays and browns. For Gable, the toupee was never about vanity alone. In the ruthless machinery of the studio system, youth was profit, and a thinning crown could mean thinner contracts. Baldness was not part of the fantasy he sold, and he knew it. So he wore the crown, quite literally, with the same confidence he brought to every role. Never drawing attention to it, never admitting it. The audience never suspected a thing. And that was the point. The illusion held. The myth endured. And Clark Gable remained a king, even if the throne came with its secrets. Cary Grant, elegance engineered. Cary Grant didn't just walk into a room, he glided. Every gesture was measured, every glance layered with charm, every word delivered with velvet precision. On screen, he was the embodiment of sophistication, the man who could make a tuxedo look like armor and a witty remark sound like seduction. But beneath the elegance was an obsessive perfectionism, and beneath the famously suave exterior, a carefully managed illusion. Grant's battle with thinning hair began long before his Hollywood ascent. Unlike some of his contemporaries, he didn't lose it suddenly. It was gradual, subtle, creeping in like time itself. But Grant was a craftsman, not just in performance, but in appearance. He didn't surrender to the mirror. Instead, he designed around it. He wore partial hairpieces and scalp blending techniques that, even up close, appeared seamless. His toupees weren't theatrical, but architectural, structured to follow the natural shape of his head, blended with his remaining hair in a way that made detection nearly impossible. It wasn't about hiding age. It was about maintaining form. The silhouette mattered. The illusion had to be complete, because in Grant's world, the image was the performance. In interviews, he deflected. In public, he smiled. But in private, he was meticulous, obsessive even, about grooming and maintenance. His vanity wasn't loud, it was deliberate. The goal wasn't youth, it was timelessness. And in that pursuit, even his hair became a controlled element in the symphony of Cary Grant. The result? An icon not defined by flawlessness, but by the relentless, quiet work it took to appear that way. Bing Crosby, the velvet voice, the vanishing hairline. Bing Crosby had a voice that could melt winter. Smooth, unforced, and endlessly comforting, it made him a star in music before film ever called his name. But when Hollywood came knocking, the face behind the voice had to be just as polished. The lighting had to be flattering, the angles just right, and the hair, what little remained of it, needed a bit of help. Crosby began balding young. By his early 30s, his hairline had retreated significantly, something audiences didn't often notice because they weren't supposed to. While his performances felt effortless, his appearance was quietly curated. The man who sang of white Christmases and easy living wore a toupee in nearly all his major film roles. But unlike others, Crosby didn't lean into Hollywood glamour. His hairpieces were understated, designed to blend, not impress. They were part of the illusion of casualness. Crosby didn't dazzle with physical perfection. He disarmed with comfort. And that, ironically, made the disguise even more essential. The illusion of the everyman who had it all depended on subtle continuity, a familiar hairline, a soft smile, relaxed posture. The moment the facade slipped, so might the connection. In private circles, the toupee was an open secret, sometimes even joked about. But in front of the camera, it remained sacred, never mentioned, never acknowledged. The public image of Bing Crosby was protected like a melody, smooth, complete, and untouched by the awkward edges of real life. He wasn't trying to be flawless. He was trying to be believable. And in the world of golden age stardom, that required more than just talent. It required invisible craftsmanship, stitched together strand by strand. Frank Sinatra, the hairpiece nobody dared mention. Frank Sinatra didn't walk. He owned every room he entered. With a tilted fedora and that unmistakable voice, he blurred the line between man and myth. His presence wasn't loud. It was controlled, calculated, and razor-sharp. Every gesture said, "I know who I am." And yet, beneath the swagger and spotlight, Sinatra carried a quiet insecurity, one that followed him from backroom clubs to the biggest stages in the world. His hair began to betray him early. By the time he was conquering the charts and seducing audiences in smoky nightclubs, Sinatra was already fighting a losing battle with his scalp. The thinning wasn't just noticeable, it was alarming to a man obsessed with appearance and control. For someone who curated every detail of his image, from tailored suits to cigarette angles, a receding hairline was unacceptable. So the toupees entered the picture, first subtle, then strategic, eventually essential. Sinatra wore them in nearly all his major film roles and public appearances from the 1950s onward. They were expertly made, custom-colored, and applied with the same precision he expected from an orchestra. There was no room for failure. The illusion had to hold. What made it more intense was how personal it was to him. Sinatra was famously sensitive about the subject. Those close to him knew, don't mention the hair. Don't joke, don't ask, don't even glance too long. For a man who seemed untouchable, his hairline remained the one topic that could shift his mood like a wrong note in a perfect melody. Still, he never let the public see the cracks. The hairpiece became part of the uniform, as crucial to the performance as his voice or his stare. And like everything Sinatra touched, it was delivered with conviction and worn like armor. Fred Astaire, dancing on air, held together by thread. Fred Astaire seemed to defy gravity. He didn't just dance, he floated, glided, skimmed the floor with a grace that felt effortless, almost supernatural. Audiences believed what they saw, a man untouched by time, untouched by strain. But while his feet moved like poetry, the camera never revealed the work it took to keep the illusion intact, above the eyes at the very top, where the magic began to fray. Astaire's hair had begun thinning long before he reached screen immortality. By the time he was mesmerizing viewers in black and white ballrooms with Ginger Rogers, the reality was already clear. The elegance didn't stop at the shoes. It extended to the scalp, carefully managed, routinely concealed. His toupees weren't theatrical or bold. They were functional, precise, engineered to move with him. Because for Astaire, every frame was choreography. His hair couldn't shift or falter during a pirouette or fall flat during close-up. Every dance sequence required not just stamina, but structure. Hairpieces were fitted to withstand movement, sweat, lighting, all while never calling attention to themselves. This wasn't just vanity. It was professionalism. Astaire understood the camera's unforgiving eye. He didn't wear the toupee to fool the audience. He wore it to preserve the purity of performance. No distractions. No breaks in the fantasy. He never spoke about it, never addressed it. There was no need. The illusion wasn't for show. It was for rhythm, timing, perfection. The man who rehearsed until his feet bled wasn't going to let a few missing strands break the spell. Fred Astaire danced like he was made of air. And sometimes the very thing holding that illusion together was stitched invisibly just above the brow. Yul Brynner, the bald icon who wore wigs to begin with. Yul Brynner is remembered as one of cinema's most iconic bald figures, a man who turned a shaved head into a symbol of power, elegance, and absolute command. His bare scalp became part of his mystique, a visual signature that defined roles from The King and I to the Ten Commandments. But what many forget is this: the very image that made him legendary began with a wig. Before he embraced the clean-shaven look, Brynner wore hair, and not always his own. In early stage roles and screen appearances, wigs were part of the costume. Not for vanity, but for transformation. He understood the power of appearance, and he wielded it like a blade. Whether portraying historical rulers or cinematic tyrants, he used hairpieces to build personas, structured, sculpted, almost architectural in their design. But when Brynner shaved his head for The King and I in the early 1950s, something unexpected happened. The baldness worked. It commanded. The look was stark, modern, unforgettable, and he kept it. Audiences thought it was a radical choice. What they didn't know was that it was also a calculated shift away from the wigs he had long relied on. Still, the wigs never truly disappeared. In roles that required period accuracy or a youthful past, Brynner would don full hairpieces again, crafted not to deceive, but to transform. He didn't hide baldness. He used it, and when hair was needed, he used that too, another tool in the arsenal of performance. In a world obsessed with hiding flaws, Brynner turned exposure into dominance. But behind that fearless dome was a man who had once worn the mask, and who knew better than anyone how powerful the illusion of hair could be. Sean Connery. Bond's hair was licensed to disappear. Sean Connery brought James Bond to life with a level of confidence so commanding it redefined masculinity on screen. He wasn't just cool, he was cool. With a smirk, a tux, and a Walther PPK, he became a global icon. But while audiences were mesmerized by the swagger, few realized that 007's greatest gadget wasn't on his wrist or in his Aston Martin, it was on his head. By the time Connery was cast in Dr. No, his hair was already thinning, a fact producers were quick to notice and quicker to solve. From his very first appearance as Bond, Connery wore a toupee. Not once in the original Bond films did he play the role with his natural hairline. What audiences saw as effortless style was, in truth, a perfectly fitted and styled hairpiece crafted to maintain the illusion of youthful dominance. But this wasn't a simple vanity play. The character of Bond was designed to be invincible, ageless, untouchable, physically flawless. A receding hairline didn't fit that fantasy. Connery understood this and accepted the wig not as a mask, but as equipment, part of the uniform, as essential to Bond as the tuxedo or the vodka martini. What's striking is how invisible the artifice was. The toupees were molded to match Connery's natural contours, styled with deliberate imperfection to avoid suspicion. And they worked. To this day, many fans remain unaware that the most iconic Bond moments, the casino introductions, the rooftop chases, the seductions, were performed under synthetic strands. Off-screen, Connery was less concerned. As his career continued, he eventually abandoned the hairpieces in favor of authenticity. But during Bond's golden era, the illusion held. Seamless, undetectable. Because even legends sometimes need a little reinforcement, especially when the world expects perfection. William Shatner, The Final Frontier, was just the beginning. William Shatner didn't just portray Captain Kirk, he became him. Bold, commanding, endlessly expressive, he charted galaxies with a furrowed brow and a gleam in his eye. But while audiences were focused on phasers, starships, and alien diplomacy, there was another mission quietly underway, one that had nothing to do with science fiction and everything to do with image control. Long before Star Trek beamed him into pop culture history, Shatner had begun grappling with hair loss. By the 1960s, as he stepped into the captain's chair, the battle was already in full swing. And though the budget for the original series was tight, there was always room in the wardrobe for one crucial piece: the toupee. His hairpieces became part of the Starfleet uniform, consistently styled, firmly secured, and camera-ready. Under bright studio lights and heavy production schedules, the hair had to hold. Not for vanity, but for continuity. A starship captain didn't age. He evolved. And hair, like every other part of the illusion, had to follow that rule. What makes Shatner's case unique is how long the mystery endured. Despite decades in the spotlight, interviews, and appearances, the topic of his hair remained a curious, unspoken elephant in the room. Was it real? Was it not? The ambiguity itself became part of the persona, half inside joke, half unsolvable riddle. He never publicly confirmed it, never admitted to anything. And that silence only amplified the myth. Fans speculated. Stylists whispered. But Kirk remained unshaken, hair intact, as if space itself had frozen time around him. Whether on Earth or the Enterprise, William Shatner knew one thing for certain. In show business, the illusion isn't just part of the performance. Sometimes it is the performance. Danny Kaye, the comedian who covered more than just lines. Danny Kaye was chaos in motion, a whirlwind of energy, voices, and elastic facial expressions. He could sing, dance, joke, and shift emotional gears with alarming speed. On screen, he was a human cartoon, but one with surprising depth and control. Every tick was intentional, every beat rehearsed. But beneath the manic joy and theatrical charm was a quiet concern about the one thing he couldn't control: his disappearing hair. Kaye began losing his hair relatively early, and though his comedic persona didn't demand matinee looks, he still existed under the microscope of studio expectations. In the golden age of Hollywood, appearance wasn't just a visual tool, it was currency. Leading men, even the funny ones, had to maintain a certain polish. For Kaye, that meant using hairpieces, often subtle, always strategic. His toupees weren't flamboyant or overly styled. They weren't meant to fool in a glamour shot way. Instead, they were tools of continuity, meant to preserve the image of a man whose physicality was central to his comedy. The gestures, the rapid head turns, the zany expressions, they all required a consistent silhouette. The hair couldn't shift or distract, especially when the face was doing so much heavy lifting. Kaye, ever the perfectionist, treated the wig like part of the costume. Not with shame, but with precision. The goal wasn't deception. It was cohesion. The audience wasn't supposed to notice anything. Not the preparation, not the adjustments, just the performance, polished and uninterrupted. In a world where comedy often meant vulnerability, Danny Kaye made sure the one thing that truly unsettled him stayed hidden. Not out of insecurity, but out of dedication to the illusion he worked so hard to perfect. George Raft, the gangster with a carefully planted alibi. George Raft didn't act tough, he was tough. On and off the screen, his reputation carried weight. Before he was lighting up the screen with stone-cold stares and gangster swagger, he was a real-life street kid from Hell's Kitchen, rumored to have ties that blurred the line between film noir and actual crime. But beneath the hard-boiled exterior and slick suits was a man who, like many of his era, protected his image with quiet precision, especially when it came to his hair. Raph's look was iconic, slicked back, jet black, unbothered by movement or age. But by the 1940s, the roots of that image began to thin. His hairline crept backward, the crown started to fade. And in a town where perception ruled over truth, Raph made a decision. The character couldn't change, so the man behind it had to adapt. His toupees weren't dramatic. They were controlled, clean, built to hold under pressure. Under sweat. Under scrutiny. Not a strand out of place, not a shift on camera. Just the same cold confidence, topped with a layer of invisible assistance. Unlike the romantic leads of the time, Raph didn't sell charm or vulnerability. He sold dominance. Authority. A man like that couldn't be seen unraveling. And so the hair, like the roles he played, remained frozen in defiance. Thick, black, and immovable. He never acknowledged the disguise. He didn't need to. The silence fit the brand. In Raph's world, there were no explanations, no apologies, only appearances. And those, he made sure, stayed bulletproof. Even when the spotlight faded and the roles slowed, the look held steady. The gangster to the end, never caught slipping, not even by time. Gene Kelly, dancing through the spotlight, under synthetic skies. Gene Kelly moved like he was born in rhythm. Every step, every pivot, every glance toward the camera was soaked in charisma. He wasn't just a dancer, he was a force of nature in motion. Muscular, confident, masculine in a way that redefined how dance was seen in film. But for all the physical perfection he displayed on screen, one detail was being carefully choreographed above the eyes, his thinning hair. Kelly's films demanded intensity, extended dance numbers, close-ups under hot lights, long takes with no room for error. And through it all, his image had to remain pristine. His hairline, however, had begun its slow retreat by the height of his fame. For a man whose strength was physicality and control, this one change couldn't be allowed to disrupt the frame. So the hairpieces entered the performance. They weren't theatrical or attention-grabbing. They were practical. Lightweight, flexible, sweat-resistant, designed not for looks alone, but for endurance. Kelly's choreography was punishing, often physically grueling. Every move had to be accounted for, including how the hairpiece would behave when his body twisted mid-leap, or when sweat began to build under studio lights. It wasn't about ego. It was about seamlessness. The viewer couldn't be pulled out of the magic by something as earthly as a shifting hairline. His toupees were like set pieces, built into the scene, invisible by design. Gene Kelly never spoke about it. He didn't need to. He performed past it, through it. The illusion held because the work behind it was as intense as the dances themselves. When the music played, the screen lit up, and the man who seemed to defy gravity did so with just a little help, stitched quietly beneath the spotlight. Tony Curtis, the heartthrob who refused to fade. Tony Curtis was Hollywood gloss at its most intoxicating, smooth-talking, sharp-dressed, impossibly good-looking. He burst onto the screen like he'd been born under a Klieg light, with a jawline sculpted for close-ups and a voice that could flirt its way out of any line of dialogue. But even golden boys are on borrowed time. And Curtis, like many before him, found himself quietly at war with his reflection. By the 1960s, the cracks began to show. The once thick, perfectly coiffed hair started to thin. And in an industry that treated youth as currency, the man who had once been the face of irresistible charm wasn't about to give ground to time without a fight. Curtis turned to hairpieces, not occasionally, not experimentally, but as part of his armor. They were polished, styled, updated with the times. The hair changed as the decades did, from sleek 60s waves to the thicker, almost theatrical styles of his later public appearances. Sometimes they seemed too perfect, too symmetrical, too static. But Curtis wore them with the same unshakable confidence he brought to every line, every red carpet, every flashbulb. For him, it was never about subtlety. It was about presence. Even as roles shifted and headlines faded, Curtis insisted on maintaining the image. The leading man look. The silhouette that had once made audiences swoon. The toupee didn't just preserve his hair, it preserved his identity. He never flinched from the artifice. He embraced it. Reinvention was part of the job, and if that meant synthetic strands under makeup chairs and hot lights, so be it. For Tony Curtis, looking like a star was non-negotiable, even if by the end the stardust was clipped on before the cameras rolled. Hollywood has always been a place of illusion, a carefully constructed world where myths are made, flaws are softened, and reality is reshaped one frame at a time. The actors we explored today weren't just performing on screen, they were performing in every public moment of their lives. And that's where I'd love to bring you into the conversation. Leave a comment below. I genuinely want to know your thoughts. Which story surprised you? Did any of these change how you see these stars? Or is there someone you believe should have made the list? I reply to every comment because this channel is as much yours as it is mine. These men weren't hiding in shame. They were preserving something larger than themselves, a fantasy millions believed in. In a time when aging could end a career and appearance meant opportunity, their toupees weren't disguises, they were extensions of the roles they played on screen and off. Quiet, meticulous, and necessary. So if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, tap that like button. It helps more classic film fans find their way here. And if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the bell so you're the first to know when the next deep dive drops. Thank you for spending time here, not just watching, but thinking, feeling, and remembering. These actors gave us more than performances. They gave us pieces of themselves, sometimes at great personal cost, all to keep the illusion alive. They weren't perfect, and that's exactly what makes them worth talking about. See you in the comments, and see you in the next one.